A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The kitchen floor was never truly clean, no matter how many hours Sarah spent on her hands and knees scrubbing the ancient stones, until her fingers bled and her back screamed in protest, because the Meadowbrook pack house was over 200 years old, and the grime had settled into every crack and crevice, like a permanent stain that mocked her efforts with its stubborn refusal to disappear. She'd been at it since before dawn, which meant she'd been awake for nearly 4 hours already, and the sun was just now beginning to creep through the narrow windows that lined the servants' quarters, casting weak golden light across the flagstones that she'd already scrubbed twice this morning, because Alpha Garrett had a habit of inspecting her work with white gloves and a cruel smile that promised punishment if he found even a speck of dust. Her silver hair, which she kept tied back in a severe bun, because letting it flow freely only drew unwanted attention and whispered comments about how unnatural it looked, how it marked her as different in a world where different meant dangerous, had come loose from its binding during the night, and now hung in damp strands around her face, sticking to her cheeks where sweat had gathered despite the early morning chill that made her breath fog in the air. Her hands, which had once been soft and gentle when her parents were alive and she'd helped her mother in their small garden, growing herbs and vegetables that they'd sell at the pack market, were now rough and calloused from 7 years of servitude, 7 years of scrubbing and cleaning and cooking and doing whatever degrading task Alpha Garrett deemed appropriate for someone who owed debts she hadn't created. Debts her parents had accumulated through no fault of their own before they died in that terrible farming accident that had crushed them both beneath an overturned cart loaded with hay, leaving their 17-year-old daughter completely alone in a world that had no mercy for orphans with silver hair and storm-gray eyes that people said looked like winter storms, cold and unsettling and wrong. The sound of excited chatter drifted down from the main floor above her head, where the pack's omegas, who actually mattered, the ones with families and status and proper bloodlines that could be traced back generations, were probably preparing for the day with the kind of leisure that Sarah could barely remember. And she found herself pausing in her scrubbing to listen, despite knowing that eavesdropping would earn her a beating if she was caught, because curiosity was one of the few things that servitude hadn't managed to kill in her, even after all these years. The voices were high-pitched and giddy, the way omegas sounded when they were discussing something that made their hearts race and their cheeks flush, and Sarah strained to make out the words through the thick wooden floor that separated the servants' quarters from the world above, catching fragments of conversation that made her stomach twist with something that felt uncomfortably like longing mixed with bitter resignation. "The Alpha King," one voice was saying, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush that spoke of barely contained excitement. "He's coming here, to Meadowbrook. Can you believe it? The actual Alpha King Theron Frostborn himself, conducting a mate selection tour across the entire kingdom because he's rejected every single eligible Omega from every noble family, and now he's expanding his search to include all territories, even small ones like ours." Another voice chimed in, this one lower and more calculating, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who understood how to manipulate situations to her advantage and wasn't afraid to use whatever weapons she had at her disposal, saying something about how this was an unprecedented opportunity, how any Omega between the ages of 18 and 30 who was unmated would be required to present themselves for the Alpha King's consideration, how this could change everything for whoever caught his eye, and convinced him that she was worthy of standing beside him as Luna Queen of the entire Northern Territories. Sarah sat back on her heels, her scrub brush dripping soapy water onto the stones she'd just cleaned, and felt something dark and painful twist in her chest at the realization that somewhere in the world there were women who actually believed they had a chance at catching an alpha king's attention. Women who could look in the mirror and see someone worthy of love and devotion, instead of seeing what Sarah saw every morning when she caught her reflection in the wash basin, which was a too thin omega with prominent collarbones that spoke of meals skipped to save money, with hair the color of moonlight that marked her as strange, with eyes that held too much pain for someone who was only 24 years old, but felt ancient in all the ways that mattered. The Alpha King wouldn't look at someone like her even if she were presented to him on a silver platter wearing the finest silks and jewels, because men like him, alphas who ruled kingdoms and commanded armies and had their pick of the most beautiful, accomplished, wealthy omegas in the territories, didn't waste their time on servants who scrubbed floors for a living, and whose only claim to any kind of distinction was the unusual color of their hair, which most people considered more of a curse than a blessing anyway. She'd heard stories about Theron Frostborn, everyone had, because he was famous for his impossible standards and his cold rejections that had earned him the nickname the Frost King, among the common people who loved to gossip about the nobility. Stories about how he'd rejected 247 potential mates over the course of 5 years, how he'd looked each one in the eye and found them lacking in some indefinable way that no one could quite explain, how he seemed determined to remain unmated forever rather than accept anyone who didn't meet his mysterious criteria for whatever it was he was actually searching for in a partner. The door at the top of the stairs that led down to the servants' quarters slammed open with enough force to make Sarah jump and nearly drop her brush, and Alpha Garrett's voice boomed down the narrow stairwell like thunder, rough and commanding in the way of men who were used to being obeyed without question, and who punished disobedience with casual cruelty that they justified as necessary discipline. "All servants, listen up!" he barked, his words echoing off the stone walls in a way that made them sound even more authoritative and intimidating than they already were. The Alpha King Theron Frostborn will be arriving in 3 days to conduct his mate selection tour, and this pack house needs to be absolutely spotless, pristine, perfect in every conceivable way, because if we embarrass ourselves in front of royalty, there will be consequences for everyone involved. Sarah heard multiple sets of feet scrambling and shuffling above her as the other servants responded to his summons, rushing to attend him with the kind of practiced urgency that came from years of learning that hesitation meant punishment. And she quickly set down her brush and wiped her wet hands on her already soaked apron before hurrying up the stairs herself, knowing that being the last to respond would only draw his attention in ways that never ended well for her. When she emerged into the main kitchen, where the rest of the household staff had already assembled, she deliberately kept her eyes lowered and her posture submissive in the way she'd learned to adopt whenever Alpha Garrett was in one of his moods, which was essentially always because he was the kind of alpha who derived pleasure from watching others cower, and who seemed to have a particular fondness for finding fault with Sarah specifically, as if her silver hair personally offended him and he needed to punish her for the crime of being born different. Alpha Garrett stood in the center of the kitchen with his arms crossed over his barrel chest and his face set in an expression of stern disapproval that suggested he'd already found multiple things wrong with the current state of affairs and was working himself up to delivering a speech about the importance of maintaining standards. And beside him stood Lady Vivian Goldcrest, the daughter of a powerful alpha lord from a neighboring territory, who had been visiting Meadowbrook for the past 2 weeks, supposedly to discuss trade agreements, but who everyone knew was actually here to position herself as close as possible to the Alpha King's tour route in hopes of catching his attention. Vivienne was everything that Sarah was not, which was to say, she was beautiful in the conventional way that nobles valued, with golden blonde hair that cascaded down her back in perfect waves, with porcelain skin that had never known a day of hard labor, with a figure that was simultaneously delicate and curvaceous in a way that made men stare and women seethe with jealousy, And she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being told she was special and destined for greatness. Her eyes, which were a striking shade of amber that complemented her coloring perfectly, swept over the assembled servants with barely concealed disdain, lingering on Sarah just long enough to make it clear that she'd noticed the silver hair and found it distasteful, before she turned her attention back to Alpha Garrett, with a smile that was all calculation and no warmth whatsoever. "As I was saying," Alpha Garrett continued, his voice dropping to a more conversational but no less threatening tone that somehow felt more dangerous than his earlier shouting had been. "The Alpha King's visit is an enormous opportunity for this pack, and I expect every single one of you to be on your absolute best behavior, which means no speaking unless spoken to, no drawing attention to yourselves, no existing in any way that might reflect poorly on Meadowbrook's hospitality." His gaze swept across the assembled servants and then, inevitably, landed on Sarah with the weight of a physical blow, and she felt her stomach drop as she recognized the particular quality of malice in his expression that meant he was about to single her out for humiliation. "You," he said, pointing directly at her in case there was any doubt about who he was addressing. "With the unfortunate hair situation, I want you to understand something very clearly, which is that you are to make yourself scarce during the Alpha King's visit. Stay in the servants' quarters or the back gardens, where no one of importance will accidentally encounter you, because we cannot afford to have you embarrassing this pack with your freakish appearance that makes visitors uncomfortable and raises questions about what kind of standards we maintain here." The words hit her like individual stones, each one carefully aimed to cause maximum damage, and Sarah felt her face burning with humiliation as the other servants shifted awkwardly around her, some looking sympathetic, but most simply looking relieved that they weren't the ones being targeted. Because that was how it worked in situations like this, where everyone was just trying to survive, and sympathy was a luxury that people couldn't afford when their own security was constantly at stake. Lady Vivian laughed, a sound like broken glass wrapped in silk, and said something to Alpha Garrett in a voice pitched low enough that Sarah couldn't quite make out the words, but loud enough that everyone knew they were being discussed. And the Alpha's response was a grunt of agreement followed by, "Indeed, we can't have a silver-haired freak making the Alpha King think we allow all manner of oddities to run loose in our pack house. He might get the wrong impression about our standards and our bloodlines." Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, where no one could see them trembling with a mixture of rage and shame and bitter acceptance. Because this was her life, and it had been her life for 7 years, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to change it. No amount of hard work or good behavior, or desperate hoping that would transform her into someone worthy of respect in the eyes of people like Alpha Garrett and Lady Vivian. She was a servant with silver hair and no family, and debts that bound her to this pack house as surely as if she wore chains, and the Alpha King's visit would come and go without her ever laying eyes on him, which was probably for the best anyway, because what would someone like her even say to royalty if given the chance? What could she possibly offer that he would find remotely interesting or valuable or worth his time when he had literally hundreds of noble Omegas throwing themselves at his feet, and he was rejecting them all as insufficiently perfect for his exacting standards? Alpha Garrett dismissed them all with a wave of his hand that communicated just how little he thought of servants in general, and Sarah in particular, and she turned to make her way back down to the kitchen, her mind already calculating how much work she needed to complete in the next 3 days to ensure that every surface gleamed and every corner sparkled, and there would be absolutely no excuse for Alpha Garrett to find fault with her efforts. Because if he was going to force her to hide away like a shameful secret during the royal visit, then she was at least going to make sure that her work was beyond reproach. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard Lady Vivian's voice drifting after her, saying something to one of the other noble Omegas about how unfortunate it was that some people were born with such obvious physical defects that marked them as inferior, and how it was really a mercy that the Alpha King would never have to see someone like that during his search for a proper mate. And Sarah felt something sharp and hot lodge itself in her chest, where her heart was supposed to be. Something that felt like pain, but also like anger, like resentment mixed with resignation, like the desperate wish that just once, just for a single moment, someone would look at her and see something other than a freakish servant girl, whose only value lay in her ability to scrub floors and stay invisible. The next 3 days passed in a blur of frantic preparation that left Sarah exhausted to the point of collapse, her body aching in ways that even 7 years of servitude hadn't quite prepared her for, because Alpha Garrett's standards for absolutely spotless apparently meant scrubbing things that had already been scrubbed and polishing things that already gleamed and redoing work that was already perfect just to ensure that there was no possible chance of failure. She worked 18-hour days with minimal breaks for food or rest, her hands developing new blisters on top of old calluses, her back screaming in protest every time she bent to reach yet another corner that needed cleaning, her silver hair becoming limp and dull from lack of proper washing because she was too tired to do anything more than collapse on her thin pallet in the servants' quarters each night and fall into dreamless sleep that felt more like unconsciousness than actual rest. The other servants mostly left her alone during this time, partly because everyone was too busy with their own preparations to bother with social niceties, and partly because Sarah had developed a reputation over the years for being prickly and unapproachable, which was a defensive mechanism she'd cultivated deliberately after too many instances of people pretending to be friendly, only to betray her trust when it served their interests, and she'd learned that loneliness was preferable to the pain of repeated disappointment. On the morning of the Alpha King's arrival, Sarah was banished to the herb garden behind the kitchen, a small plot of land that had been her mother's pride and joy before the accident, and which Sarah had continued to maintain over the years because it was one of the few places where she felt any connection to the parents she'd lost, where she could dig her hands into the soil and remember her mother teaching her the names of different plants and their uses, where she could almost hear her father's laugh when he'd tease her mother about her obsession with making everything grow perfectly. She was supposed to be weeding and pruning, staying occupied and out of sight while the presentation ceremony took place in the central square, where all the eligible Omegas would line up for the Alpha King's inspection like livestock at a market. And she told herself that she was relieved to be excluded, that she had no interest in participating in such a degrading spectacle, that being chosen by the Alpha King would probably be more of a curse than a blessing given his reputation for cold perfection and impossible standards. But there was a part of her, a small, stubborn, hopeful part that she tried very hard to ignore, that wondered what it would be like to be seen by someone who mattered, to be looked at as something other than a servant or a freak, to be considered worthy of love and partnership instead of just being someone who existed to scrub floors and stay invisible. And she hated that part of herself for being foolish enough to still harbor such ridiculous dreams after 7 years of learning exactly how the world worked and where she fit into its rigid hierarchy. The sound of trumpets from the central square announced the Alpha King's arrival, and Sarah found herself straightening from her work despite her best intentions, her heart beating faster in her chest for reasons she couldn't quite explain or justify, her hands stilling in the dirt as she strained to hear what was happening beyond the walls that separated her from the ceremony she wasn't allowed to attend. And she wondered if this was what hope felt like after years of learning not to hope for anything. If this uncomfortable flutter in her stomach And this inexplicable urge to somehow catch a glimpse of the legendary Alpha King, who had rejected every woman in the kingdom, was what people meant when they talked about fate and destiny and the moon goddess's plans. Or if she was just being an idiot who didn't know when to stop dreaming about impossible things that would never, could never, apply to someone like her. The collision happened so fast that Sarah didn't have time to process what was occurring until she was already on her hands and knees in a pool of spilled wine and shattered crystal. Her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she thought it might actually break through her chest, and the heavy silver tray that she'd been carrying, laden with refreshments for the private audiences that Alpha Garrett was conducting with the Alpha King and his top 5 Omega candidates, was now scattered across the polished marble floor of the corridor in a spectacular mess that would definitely, absolutely, without question, result in her being severely punished once the royal visit concluded and Alpha Garrett could take out his rage on her without witnesses to judge him for his cruelty. She'd been hurrying, practically running, because one of the other servants had told her that Lady Vivian had specifically requested more wine, and that the Alpha King himself had agreed to the request, which meant that keeping them waiting would be seen as a grave insult to their hospitality. And Sarah had been so focused on not tripping over her own feet while carrying the absurdly heavy tray that she hadn't been paying attention to where she was going. Hadn't noticed the tall figure striding around the corner with equal speed and opposite direction until their bodies collided with enough force to send her stumbling backward and the tray flying from her grip in a graceful arc that ended in catastrophic destruction against the pristine floor that she'd personally scrubbed just yesterday until her hands bled. The man she'd collided with had stumbled, but caught himself with the kind of preternatural grace that spoke of alpha reflexes and extensive combat training. And Sarah found herself looking up from her position on the floor, still reeling from the impact and trying to process what had just happened, and her eyes traveled up expensive black boots, up perfectly tailored dark trousers, up a formal jacket with silver embroidery that probably cost more than she'd earned in her entire lifetime, up a strong throat and sharp jawline with a scar along the left side, and then finally, inevitably, locked onto a face that she recognized immediately from the descriptions she'd heard and the paintings she'd glimpsed in the packhouse's formal rooms. A face that belonged to Alpha King Theron Frostborn himself, and her blood turned to ice in her veins as she realized that she'd just physically assaulted the most powerful man in the entire Northern Territories, that she'd knocked into him like a clumsy child and sent his refreshments crashing to the ground in front of him, and that her life was essentially over because there was no possible universe in which this ended well for her. His hair was silver, the exact same shade as her own, which was something the descriptions and paintings had never quite captured properly. The way it caught the light streaming through the corridor windows and seemed to glow with an almost ethereal quality that made him look like he'd been carved from moonlight and ice, and his eyes, which were now fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floor beneath her, were the most striking shade of ice blue she'd ever seen, pale and cold and penetrating in a way that made her feel like he could see straight through her skin and bones to whatever pathetic excuse for a soul she possessed. Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment of eye contact, stretching out impossibly long while Sarah's mind raced through every possible outcome of this situation and found nothing but variations of disaster. Because alphas didn't forgive omegas who physically assaulted them, especially when those omegas were lowly servants with no status or protection. And alpha kings definitely didn't forgive such transgressions, regardless of whether they were accidents or deliberate acts of aggression. She should apologize, should grovel, should throw herself at his feet and beg for mercy in the most abject and humiliating way possible. Because that was what servants did when they offended their betters. That was how you survived in a world where your life was worth less than the crystal glasses now shattered across the floor. But the words wouldn't come because she was frozen in his gaze, trapped like a rabbit facing a wolf, unable to move or speak or do anything except stare at him and notice absurd details like the way his silver hair fell slightly across his forehead despite being styled back, or the way his pupils had dilated slightly when their eyes met, or the way he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that seemed almost like recognition, even though that was impossible, because they'd never met and he would have no reason to recognize a servant from a minor pack that he'd probably never heard of before this tour brought him to their insignificant corner of his kingdom. The moment shattered when Captain Rowan Steelheart, the Alpha King's personal guard and beta, came rushing around the corner with his hand already on his sword, his expression fierce and protective in the way of men whose entire purpose in life was keeping their charge safe from any possible threat. And his voice, when he spoke, was sharp with barely restrained violence as he barked, "Step away from the king immediately. Identify yourself and explain what you think you're doing, assaulting His Majesty in a public corridor where anyone could have witnessed your attack." Sarah flinched at the accusation, at the word assault, that transformed an accident into something criminal and intentional. And she tried to find her voice, tried to explain that she hadn't been attacking anyone, that she'd simply been carrying refreshments and they'd collided by accident. But her throat had closed up with fear and shock, and the overwhelming awareness that she was kneeling in broken glass that was cutting through her thin servant's dress and into her knees, adding physical pain to the emotional turmoil that was threatening to overwhelm her completely. Captain Rowan took a step toward her with clear intent to forcibly remove her from the king's presence, possibly using methods that would involve significantly more violence than was strictly necessary, and Sarah braced herself for the impact, for hands that would grab her roughly and throw her against the wall or drag her away to whatever punishment awaited servants who dared to touch royalty. But instead, she heard the Alpha King's voice, smooth and cold as winter ice, cutting through the tension with absolute authority as he said, "Stop, Captain. She didn't touch me. It was clearly an accident. Two people moving too quickly around a blind corner and colliding with unfortunate but entirely predictable results. There's no need for dramatic interventions or accusations of assault." Sarah's head snapped up in shock at the reprieve, at the unexpected mercy from someone who had absolutely no reason to show her any consideration whatsoever. And she found the Alpha King still watching her with that same unreadable expression, his ice-blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness, and something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like the pull she'd heard other Omegas describe when they talked about meeting their mates. The instant recognition and attraction that supposedly characterized the mate bond when it formed between compatible wolves. But that was ridiculous, impossible, completely absurd, because mate bonds didn't form between Alpha Kings and servant Omegas because he was royalty and she was nobody, because the moon goddess didn't make matches that violated every social convention and practical consideration, and besides, he was here specifically looking for a mate among the eligible noble Omegas who could bring him political alliances and powerful bloodlines, not among the servants who scrubbed his floors and stayed invisible in corners where they wouldn't offend anyone with their freakish appearances. She forced herself to speak, forced words through her constricted throat even though they came out rough and shaky, saying, "I apologize profusely, Your Majesty. I wasn't watching where I was going. I was in a hurry to bring refreshments to your private audience, and I failed to exercise proper caution, and I take full responsibility for this accident and any inconvenience or offense it may have caused you. And I will clean this mess immediately and ensure that fresh refreshments are delivered without further delay." The words came out in a rush, formal and subservient in the way she'd been trained to speak to her betters, and she started to push herself up from the floor, ignoring the way broken glass was embedding itself more deeply into her knees with the movement, determined to fulfill her duties even if she was bleeding and shaking, and absolutely terrified of what would happen once the Alpha King left and Alpha Garrett found out about this incident. But before she could fully rise, the Alpha King's voice stopped her again, and this time there was something in his tone that sounded almost like curiosity, like genuine interest rather than the cold dismissal she'd been expecting, as he asked, "What's your name?" The question was so unexpected, so completely outside the normal parameters of how royalty interacted with servants, that Sarah actually hesitated before answering, her mind temporarily blanking, because why would the Alpha King want to know her name? Why would he care about the identity of a clumsy servant who'd nearly knocked him over in a corridor? And she saw Captain Rowan's eyebrows rise in surprise at the question, saw the way he exchanged a quick glance with one of the other guards who had appeared during the commotion, and she realized that this wasn't normal behavior for the king, that he didn't usually inquire about servants' names or show any interest in them beyond their ability to perform their assigned tasks. "Sarah, Your Majesty," she finally managed to say, her voice steadier now that she had something concrete to focus on. "My name is Sarah Winterlight. I'm a servant in Alpha Garrett's household, assigned to kitchen and cleaning duties." She kept her eyes lowered now, not daring to look at him again because that first moment of eye contact had done something to her, had stirred something in her chest that felt dangerous and foolish and completely inappropriate for someone in her position, and she didn't trust herself not to do something stupid, like stare at him with obvious longing, or say something that would reveal just how much his unexpected mercy had affected her. "Sarah?" he repeated, and the way he said her name, testing it on his tongue like it was something precious rather than the simple designation of a nobody servant, made her shiver involuntarily and hope desperately that no one noticed her reaction. "Your hair," he continued, and she felt her stomach drop because here it came, the inevitable comment about her freakish appearance, the observation that she looked unnatural and wrong and cursed, "is silver, the same shade as mine, which is a trait I've never encountered in anyone outside my immediate bloodline, a hereditary characteristic that marks the royal family and has for generations." There was something in his voice that she couldn't quite identify, something that wasn't disgust or mockery, but rather sounded almost like wonder or recognition, and she risked another glance up at him, needing to see his expression to understand what he was actually thinking, and found him still studying her with that intense focus that made her feel like the only person in the entire corridor, despite the guards and other servants who had started to gather at a respectful distance to watch this unusual interaction. "It's an unfortunate family trait, Your Majesty," Sarah heard herself say, and she wasn't sure where the words were coming from or why she was being so honest, instead of giving him the deferential platitudes that servants were supposed to offer to royalty. "A genetic quirk that makes me stand out when I'd much rather blend in and be invisible, because being different in a world that values conformity is rarely an advantage for those of us without status or power to protect us from judgment." She saw his eyes narrow slightly at her words, saw something that might have been respect or appreciation flicker across his aristocratic features, and she realized with a jolt of surprise that he'd actually heard what she was saying, that he was listening to her words rather than just dismissing them as the meaningless chatter of a servant. And that realization was somehow more terrifying than the entire collision incident, because it suggested that he saw her as a person rather than just a function, as someone whose thoughts and feelings might actually matter rather than just a body that performed tasks. The sound of rapid footsteps approaching from the direction of the formal receiving rooms shattered the moment, and Sarah recognized the heavy tread of Alpha Garrett, even before he came barreling around the corner, with his face flushed red with rage and his eyes already seeking her out with the promise of violence in their depths. And she knew immediately that someone had informed him of the incident, probably one of the servants who'd witnessed the collision and who'd rushed to report her transgression before she could spin the story in her favor. Not that she would have tried to lie about what happened, but that was irrelevant now because Alpha Garrett was here, and he was furious, and she was absolutely going to pay for this embarrassment in ways that would leave marks for weeks. You clumsy, worthless, pathetic excuse for a servant. Alpha Garrett snarled as he grabbed her upper arm with bruising force, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to make her gasp with pain. I specifically told you to stay out of sight, to not draw any attention to yourself, to not exist anywhere that His Majesty might encounter you. And what do? You assault the Alpha King in a public corridor and create a scene that reflects poorly on my entire pack. And you can be absolutely certain that you will be severely punished for this transgression once our royal guest has departed, and I can deal with you properly without witnesses to interfere with necessary discipline. He started dragging her away from the scene, away from the broken glass and spilled wine, and most importantly away from the Alpha King, whose presence was apparently too valuable to be wasted on dealing with incompetent servants. And Sarah didn't resist, because resistance would only make things worse, and because she was honestly grateful for the opportunity to escape before she did something even more foolish, like continuing to stare at the silver-haired Alpha King, who was looking at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve, rather than an inconvenience to be dismissed. But then the Alpha King's voice rang out again, sharp and commanding, in a way that made Alpha Garrett freeze mid-step, and made every person in the corridor immediately stop whatever they were doing, and turn their full attention to their sovereign. And he said, "Release her immediately, Alpha Garrett. The accident was minor, and entirely my fault for moving too quickly through your corridors without proper attention to my surroundings, and I will not have your servant punished for something that was clearly not her responsibility or within her control to prevent." The words were polite, diplomatic even, but there was steel underneath them, an unmistakable tone of command that made it clear this wasn't a request or a suggestion, but rather an order from the Alpha King that could not be refused or questioned without serious consequences. Alpha Garrett's grip on Sarah's arm loosened immediately, his fingers releasing her so quickly that she stumbled slightly, and she saw the way his expression transformed from rage to forced civility in the space of a heartbeat. The way he schooled his features into something approaching pleasant deference, even though she could still see the fury burning in his eyes, and knew that she would pay for this humiliation later, in private, where the Alpha King's protection couldn't reach her. "Of course, Your Majesty," Alpha Garrett said through what was clearly gritted teeth hidden behind a false smile. "I meant no disrespect. I was simply concerned about proper protocol and maintaining appropriate standards of service during your visit. But if you feel the incident requires no further action, then I will naturally defer to your judgment in this matter." The Alpha King made a dismissive gesture that somehow managed to convey his complete lack of interest in Alpha Garrett's explanations or justifications. And then he turned his attention back to Sarah, who was still standing there frozen and confused, and absolutely certain that she'd somehow fallen into an alternate reality where Alpha Kings defended servants and showed concern for their welfare. And he asked, in that same intense, focused tone that made her feel like his entire world had narrowed to just her, "Are you injured, Sarah? I noticed you were kneeling in broken glass, and I want to ensure that you receive proper medical attention if necessary." The question was so absurd, so completely outside her frame of reference for how people in power treated people without power, that she actually laughed, a short, bitter sound that escaped before she could stop it, and she saw his eyebrows rise slightly at her reaction, saw something that might have been amusement or offense flicker across his features. "I'm fine, Your Majesty," she said, and this time she didn't bother trying to make her voice deferential or subservient, because apparently she'd already crossed so many lines today that one more wouldn't make any difference. "I've knelt in worse things than broken glass during my 7 years of service here, and minor cuts and bruises are just part of the job description for those of us who occupy the lower rungs of pack hierarchy. Nothing that requires royal concern or medical intervention." She saw Captain Rowan's eyes widen at her tone, saw the way several of the guards shifted uneasily at what was clearly borderline insubordination from a servant addressing the Alpha King, but Theron himself just continued to study her with that same unreadable expression, and she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch slightly, as if he was suppressing a smile, as if he found her bluntness refreshing rather than offensive. "Nevertheless," the Alpha King said after a long moment of silence, during which Sarah became acutely aware that everyone in the corridor was watching this interaction with varying degrees of shock and fascination. "I would like you to have those cuts examined and properly treated. Consider it a direct order from your Alpha King if you need official justification for taking time away from your regular duties." He turned to Captain Rowan and said something in a low voice that Sarah couldn't quite hear, and then he was striding away down the corridor, with his guards falling into formation around him, leaving Sarah standing there, with Alpha Garrett still hovering nearby, and wearing an expression that promised future retribution for this entire embarrassing incident. And she felt something like disappointment settle in her chest at his departure, even though she knew it was foolish to feel anything at all about a royal alpha who existed in a completely different world from her own. She was bending down to start cleaning up the mess of broken glass and spilled wine, ignoring the pain in her knees and the way her hands were shaking with delayed reaction to everything that had just happened, when Captain Rowan reappeared at her elbow and said in a tone that was surprisingly gentle for someone who'd been ready to forcibly remove her from the king's presence just minutes earlier. "His Majesty has requested that you join him for the evening meal tonight. He wishes to discuss your knowledge of medicinal herbs and plants. Apparently he overheard you mentioning something to another servant earlier about the herb garden, and he's interested in consulting with someone who has practical experience in that area." The statement was so absurd, so completely impossible, that Sarah actually thought she might have misheard or misunderstood, because Alpha Kings did not invite servants to dine with them, did not consult with lowly Omegas about anything, did not show interest in the practical knowledge of people who had no formal education or training. And she opened her mouth to say that there must be some mistake, that he couldn't possibly mean her. But Captain Rowan was already walking away with a slight smile on his face that suggested he knew exactly how shocking this invitation was and was enjoying her confusion, and she was left standing in the corridor surrounded by broken glass and the shocked stares of every servant and guard who had witnessed this entire impossible interaction, knowing that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to understand or predict, and that when she showed up for that evening meal, if she actually dared to show up, she would be crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, entering a world where servants didn't belong, and where her silver hair and storm-gray eyes and sharp tongue might either save her or destroy her completely. And she had absolutely no idea which outcome was more likely, or which one she should actually be hoping for, as she stood there with bleeding knees and a racing heart, and the memory of ice-blue eyes that had looked at her like she might actually matter. The evening meal turned out to be nothing like what Sarah had expected, which was probably fortunate, because what she'd expected was some sort of formal dinner, with dozens of nobles and servants hovering in the background, while she was interrogated about her herb knowledge, and then dismissed like an interesting but ultimately irrelevant curiosity. But instead, she found herself seated around a campfire in a small clearing just outside the packhouse grounds, with only the Alpha King, Captain Rowan, and herself, forming an intimate circle that felt surreal and dreamlike in its casual informality. The Alpha King had changed out of his formal attire and was now wearing simple traveling clothes that made him look less like an untouchable sovereign and more like an actual person. Though the silver hair and ice blue eyes and the aura of absolute authority that surrounded him like a physical presence still marked him as someone extraordinary, someone who could never truly blend in or become ordinary no matter what he wore or how he chose to present himself. Captain Rowan had started the fire and was now tending it with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years on military campaigns, and he'd explained in a quiet aside while the king was occupied with something else that Theron preferred these informal gatherings to stuffy formal dinners whenever possible, that he found them more conducive to actual conversation and genuine human connection rather than the performative politics that characterized most royal meals. Sarah had arrived at the clearing with her knees freshly bandaged, courtesy of Elder Miriam, who had appeared at the servants' quarters with healing salves and knowing looks and cryptic comments about silver calling to silver that Sarah had been too nervous and confused to properly process, and she'd changed into her only other dress, which was still clearly a servant's garment, but at least wasn't covered in wine stains and didn't have holes worn through at the knees, and she'd taken down her silver hair from its usual severe bun and left it hanging loose down her back because some part of her, some reckless and slightly defiant part, had decided that if the Alpha King wanted to have a conversation with her, then he was going to have a conversation with the real her, not some carefully constructed version designed to make herself smaller and less noticeable. The conversation had started awkwardly, with Theron asking formal questions about her knowledge of medicinal plants and Sarah giving carefully measured responses that revealed her expertise while trying not to sound like she was showing off or claiming knowledge she didn't possess. But somewhere around the time Captain Rowan had served them all bowls of hearty stew and fresh bread that must have come from the packhouse kitchens, the formality had begun to dissolve, and they'd fallen into a genuine discussion about the properties of various herbs and the differences between book learning and practical experience. Sarah found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, explaining how she'd taught herself from discarded medical texts and old herbalist journals that she'd found in the packhouse library, how she'd experimented in the small garden behind the kitchens and learned through trial and error which plants grew best in their climate and which combinations produced the most effective remedies, and she talked about her mother, who had been a gifted herbalist before her death, and who had passed on a natural intuition for healing that Sarah had inherited, along with her unfortunate silver hair. Theron listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated he was actually processing what she was saying rather than just making polite conversation, and he shared his own observations about the healing practices he'd encountered during his travels throughout the kingdom, and Sarah was shocked to discover that beneath the cold, intimidating exterior that had earned him his nickname, the Alpha King was actually someone with curiosity and intelligence and a surprising lack of arrogance when it came to admitting the limitations of his own knowledge. Captain Rowan had excused himself after the meal was finished, citing some vague need to check on the guards, but making it abundantly clear through his knowing smile that he was deliberately leaving them alone. And Sarah had felt her heart rate increase at the realization that she was now sitting by a campfire with the Alpha King, with no chaperone or buffer or excuse to escape if the conversation took an uncomfortable turn. The silence that fell after Rowan's departure was heavy with unspoken things, with the awareness that something significant was happening between them, even though neither of them had explicitly acknowledged it. And Sarah found herself studying the flames rather than looking at Theron because she was afraid of what she might see in his face, or what he might see in hers, if their eyes met again with the same intensity as that moment in the corridor. "Can I ask you something?" Theron finally said, breaking the silence with a question that sounded genuinely curious rather than interrogative. And I want you to answer with the same honesty you've shown all evening, not with what you think I want to hear, but with what you actually believe." Sarah nodded, still not looking at him, and he continued. "Why weren't you at the presentation ceremony this afternoon? I noticed during my review of the eligible Omegas that there was a notable absence, a gap in the lineup where someone should have been standing. And later, when I inquired with Alpha Garrett about whether all eligible pack members had been presented, he became evasive and changed the subject, which made me suspect that someone had been deliberately excluded." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach at the question, at the implication that he'd specifically noticed her absence and inquired about it, that he'd been looking for her among the candidates, even though they'd never met before the collision, and he had no reason to expect her to be there. And she realized that she had two choices in how to answer, which were to give him a diplomatic non-answer that protected Alpha Garrett and maintained the fiction that everything was proper and correct, or to tell him the truth and risk the consequences of exposing the casual cruelty that governed life for those at the bottom of pack hierarchies. She chose truth, partly because she was tired of lying and pretending and making herself smaller to accommodate other people's prejudices, and partly because something about the way Theron had looked at her, the way he'd defended her and shown interest in her thoughts and invited her to this meal, made her think that maybe, just maybe, he actually wanted to hear the real answer rather than a comfortable fiction. "I wasn't permitted to attend, Your Majesty," she said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the flames that danced and flickered in the evening breeze. "Alpha Garrett specifically ordered me to stay out of sight during your visit because he felt that my appearance, particularly my silver hair, would be embarrassing to the pack and might give you the wrong impression about the standards and bloodlines maintained here. And he was concerned that having someone who looks as unnatural and freakish as I do anywhere near the presentation ceremony would reflect poorly on Meadowbrook's hospitality and reputation." She heard Theron draw in a sharp breath at her words, heard the rustle of fabric as he shifted position, and she risked a glance in his direction to find him staring at her with an expression of such barely contained fury that she actually flinched, though she realized after a moment that the anger wasn't directed at her, but rather at Alpha Garrett and the circumstances she'd just described. "That's unacceptable," Theron said, and his voice was cold enough to freeze water, filled with the kind of royal displeasure that could end careers and destroy reputations. "Excluding an eligible Omega from the presentation ceremony based on physical appearance is a direct violation of the mate selection tour protocols, which explicitly state that all unmated Omegas within the specified age range must be given the opportunity to present themselves for consideration. And the fact that Alpha Garrett felt justified in excluding you because your hair happens to be the same color as mine, as the royal bloodline, demonstrates either profound stupidity or deliberate insubordination." He stood abruptly, pacing around the fire with restless energy that spoke of someone barely controlling their temper, and Sarah watched him with a mixture of fascination and fear, because she'd never seen someone so powerful express genuine anger on her behalf, had never experienced what it felt like to have someone with actual authority care about the injustices she faced. "But more than that," Theron continued, turning to face her with those ice-blue eyes blazing with intensity, "the fact that you've been made to feel freakish and unnatural because of your hair, because of a trait that marks you as special and unique rather than ordinary, that's the real crime here. Because I've spent the past 5 years meeting hundreds of Omegas who all look essentially the same, who all blend together into one homogeneous mass of perfect features and practiced smiles and carefully calculated presentations designed to showcase their supposed worthiness. And not one of them, not a single one, has stood out or captured my attention or made me feel anything except exhausted boredom. But you, Sarah Winterlight, with your silver hair and your storm gray eyes and your refusal to make yourself smaller or less honest to accommodate other people's comfort, you're the first person in 5 years who's made me feel actually awake and present and interested in the possibility of genuine connection. The confession hung in the air between them like something physical and tangible, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as she processed what he'd just said. The implications of his words that suggested he wasn't just showing casual interest or polite curiosity, but rather something deeper and more significant. Something that felt dangerously like the beginnings of the mate bond that she'd heard other Omegas describe in hushed, reverent tones. "Your Majesty," she started to say, forcing herself to address the elephant that was currently sitting by their campfire and making the air feel thick with possibility and danger. "I don't understand what's happening here. I don't understand why you're saying these things to me or what you expect me to do with this information, because you're the Alpha King conducting a mate selection tour, searching for a Luna Queen who can stand beside you and help you rule your kingdom, and I'm a servant with no family, no status, no education, no political connections, nothing to offer except some self-taught knowledge about herbs and a stubborn refusal to pretend I'm something I'm not." She stood as well, needing to feel less vulnerable than she did sitting while he loomed over her. And she wrapped her arms around herself as if that could somehow protect her from the emotional exposure of this moment. Even if you feel some kind of attraction or interest, even if there's something pulling us together that neither of us quite understands, it doesn't matter, because the practical realities of your position and my lack of position make any kind of actual relationship between us completely impossible. And I've learned through painful experience not to hope for impossible things, because hope just makes the inevitable disappointment hurt more when reality reasserts itself. Theron closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, moving so quickly that Sarah didn't have time to step back or create more space, and he was suddenly right there in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his ice-colored eyes, and count the individual silver strands of his hair, and feel the heat radiating from his body in the cool evening air. "What if I told you?" he said softly, his voice dropping to something intimate and intense that made her shiver involuntarily. "That my mother, who was a gifted seer before she died, left me a prophecy about my true mate. A prophecy that said she would challenge me with words rather than submission, that she would wear the moon's crown in her hair, which I interpret as silver like moonlight, and that she would carry healing in her heart and in her hands, and that I would find her where I least expected worth, in a place where others saw only ordinariness or worse." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and gently touched a strand of her silver hair, letting it slide through his fingers like he was handling something precious and rare. "What if I told you that I've been searching for 5 years, meeting every eligible Omega from every noble family, looking for someone who fit that description, someone who could be both my mate and my equal, someone who would see me as a person rather than just a crown, and I was starting to lose hope that such a person actually existed, that maybe my mother's prophecy was just the fever dreams of a dying woman rather than actual divine guidance? What if I told you?" he continued, and now both his hands were framing her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who commanded armies and ruled territories. "That the moment we collided in that corridor, the moment our eyes met for the first time, I felt something I've never felt before, a recognition so profound and immediate that it actually scared me, because it meant that my search was over, and it had ended in the most unexpected and impossible place, with a servant girl who should have been beneath my notice according to every social convention and practical consideration, But who is actually the only person in this entire kingdom who makes me want to stop searching and start building something real? Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes despite her best efforts to maintain some kind of emotional control. Felt them spilling down her cheeks even as she tried to blink them away. Because no one had ever said such things to her. No one had ever looked at her the way Theron was looking at her now. Like she was something valuable and worthy and precious, rather than something to be hidden away and apologized for. "I'm scared," she whispered, the admission escaping before she could stop it. "I'm scared that this is some kind of dream or delusion, that I'm going to wake up tomorrow and discover that none of this was real, that you didn't actually mean any of what you just said, or worse, that you meant it in this moment, but that reality will reassert itself tomorrow, and you'll realize that choosing a servant as your mate would be political suicide and social catastrophe, and you'll have to reject me, just like you've rejected all those other Omegas, except it will hurt so much worse because you'll have made me hope first." Theron made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl, pulling her closer until her body was pressed against his, and she could feel his heart beating as fast as her own, and he said with absolute conviction, "I'm not going to reject you, Sarah. I'm not going to change my mind, or come to my senses, or decide that political considerations are more important than finding my actual true mate, because I've spent 5 years prioritizing duty and responsibility and practical considerations, and all it's gotten me is loneliness and frustration and an empty throne beside mine that no one seems qualified to fill." He pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closing for a moment as if he was savoring the contact, and then he opened them again and looked at her with such intensity that she felt like she might catch fire from the heat of his gaze. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to make an announcement to Alpha Garrett and his council that I've found my mate, that the mate selection tour is officially concluded, and that you, Sarah Winterlight, are my chosen Luna Queen, and anyone who has a problem with that decision can take it up with me personally. And I promise you that I am very good at winning arguments, especially when they involve defending things that matter to me." The certainty in his voice, the absolute confidence that suggested he'd already made his decision and nothing was going to change it, finally broke through the walls that Sarah had spent 7 years building around her heart. The defenses that had kept her safe from disappointment and pain, but had also kept her isolated and alone, and she found herself leaning into him, letting herself believe for the first time that maybe impossible things could actually happen, that maybe the moon goddess actually did have plans that transcended social hierarchies and practical considerations. "If I agree to this," Sarah said, needing to establish some parameters even as she felt herself surrendering to the possibility of everything she'd never dared to want. "If I accept your claim and become your mate and take on the role of Luna Queen, despite having absolutely no preparation or training or understanding of what that actually entails, then I need you to promise me something." Theron nodded, his hands still cradling her face like she was something infinitely precious, and she continued, "I need you to promise that you'll never ask me to be anything other than exactly what I am. That you won't try to transform me into some idealized version of what you think a Luna Queen should be. That you'll value my honesty and my directness and my stubborn refusal to pretend even when pretending would be more diplomatic or politically advantageous. Because I've spent 7 years being told I needed to be smaller and quieter and less noticeable. And I can't go back to making myself less just to make other people more comfortable." Theron's response was to kiss her. A slow, deep, claiming kiss that left no doubt about his intentions or his feelings. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and staring at each other with a mixture of wonder and desire, and the beginning of something that felt like the mate bond settling into place between them, he said, "I promise that I will spend every day reminding you that you're exactly what I need, exactly what my kingdom needs, exactly what the moon goddess intended when she marked us both with silver hair and brought us together through a collision that probably looked like an accident, but was actually fate making sure we couldn't miss each other. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of political maneuvering and social upheaval, as Theron made good on his promise to claim Sarah as his mate, despite the shock and protest from nobles who couldn't understand why their alpha king would choose a servant over their accomplished, well-bred daughters. But Sarah discovered that having the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, publicly defending your worth and threatening anyone who questioned it, was surprisingly effective at silencing opposition. The mating ceremony was held under a full moon with thousands of witnesses, and when Theron marked her neck and claimed her as his Luna Queen before the entire assembled kingdom, Sarah felt the mate bond snap completely into place, a connection so profound and unshakable that she finally understood why people talked about fated mates with such reverence. Because this wasn't just attraction or affection or even love. This was two souls recognizing each other across all the barriers that society had tried to place between them and choosing each other anyway. She learned to navigate court politics with the same directness and honesty that had first caught Theron's attention, refusing to play the games that other nobles expected, and instead establishing herself as a Luna who actually cared about the welfare of common wolves, who used her position to create healing clinics and educational programs for Omegas from all social classes, who demonstrated through her actions that worth wasn't determined by birth, but by character and choices, and the willingness to use whatever gifts you possessed in service of others. Years later, when young Omegas would come to her feeling worthless and invisible, and convinced that their circumstances defined their possibilities, Sarah would tell them her story about being a servant with silver hair who collided with an alpha king in a corridor and discovered that sometimes the most impossible things are actually just destiny waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And she would hold their hands and look them in the eyes and say, "Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. Your value exists independent of recognition or validation or approval from those who are too blind or too limited to understand what they're looking at. And somewhere in this world, there's someone who will see you exactly as you are and recognize that you're exactly what they've been searching for. And when that happens, when you find the person who values your authenticity more than your conformity, hold on to them and build something beautiful together, despite all the voices telling you it's impossible." She would introduce them to Theron, who would still look at her after all those years with the same intensity and devotion as that first evening by the campfire. And they would see living proof that love could transcend status, and that choosing each other, truly choosing each other every single day, regardless of what fate or society or circumstance demanded, was the most powerful magic that existed in their world. If you enjoyed this story about Sarah and Theron, about a servant with silver hair who dared to be herself, and an alpha king who was brave enough to choose love over convention, please leave a comment below telling me what you thought, what moments resonated with you, whether you believed in their connection from that first collision, or whether you needed convincing along the way. I love hearing from readers about which parts of the story moved you, which characters you connected with, and what themes or messages spoke to your own experiences and beliefs about worth and love, and the courage it takes to choose authenticity over acceptance. Please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future stories about fated mates and impossible romances and characters who refuse to let their circumstances define their destinies. Because I have so many more tales to tell about wolves and magic and the transformative power of being seen and valued exactly as you are. Hit that notification bell, leave your thoughts in the comments, and remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to make yourself smaller. Refuse to accept other people's limitations on your worth. And trust that somewhere in this vast world, there's someone who will collide with you in a corridor and recognize that you're exactly what they've been searching for all along.